Hey everyone, my name is Abdullah and I work at Microsoft as an Azure Technical Advisor. The goal of this channel is to explain with simplicity. And in today's session, I will be walking you through an overview of what Azure Active Directory is. Now, I will be making more detailed videos in the future, so please stay tuned for that. With that being said, let's just get into it. All right, let's start with an overview of identity and what it really means in the general sense. So, with any IT infrastructure we need a service that's going to help us identify users, devices, and applications. And we need that service to authorize those users and devices and applications to be able to do certain things in our corporate network. And in the on-premises world, we used to do that with a domain controller. So with a domain controller, you would install Microsoft Active Directory domain services on a Windows server, and then that would configure it to be a domain controller and a DNS server at the same time. So what this domain controller does in the on-premises world is that, most importantly, it assigns you a domain. In this case, it's at test.com, but you're more used to domains like at Microsoft.com, at Google.com. A domain is nothing more than a network with a service that's responsible for assigning permissions and policies like Azure Active Directory domain service or Samba with the Linux world. And any computer or user joined to that domain is going to have certain permissions and policies applied to them. So the most basic thing that a domain controller does is that, first of all, it assigns the network a domain, and then it also manages users, groups, and devices in that domain controller service. So a typical example for that is we'd have a client that's trying to authenticate and use the corporate laptop. So what he does is he'd provide his username and password in the form of credentials, and then the domain controller would use Kerberos protocol to authenticate that user and then authorize that user to be able to do certain things in the corporate network, like preventing him from visiting the internet, for example, or from downloading softwares from the internet. And this also applies to server scenarios. You can apply what we call GPOs or group policies on servers, in this case a web server. So you could apply a group policy such as preventing this web server from installing updates, for example. And you could choose from thousands of group policies. But the main idea here is, with any IT infrastructure we build, the most basic service we're going to have is an identity service that's responsible for managing permissions and policies related to users, devices, and applications. All right, so what is Azure Active Directory? Now, the big misconception we have is that Azure Active Directory is just on-premises Active Directory thrown in the cloud. And that's a big misconception. Azure Active Directory is completely different than on-premises Active Directory, and both are actually almost always used side by side. So what is Azure Active Directory? So Azure Active Directory is just an identity service that makes authentication with cloud services much easier. So Azure Active Directory has what we call built-in federation, and I won't go through federation in greater details, but in the on-premises world, if you want to connect to a cloud application or a SaaS application, you would typically use a federation server that's going to give you back a token, which you can then use to authenticate and access that SaaS service or that cloud service. In Azure Active Directory, this process is much simpler because there is built-in federation. So the point from all of that is Azure Active Directory is just an identity service that simplifies authentication in the cloud. And as you can see in this diagram, we have this Azure Active Directory tenant, and you can actually connect to it several different cloud applications. So you can connect to it Office 365. And actually, behind the scenes, Office 365 uses Azure Active Directory to authenticate you in order to sign in and to be able to view your emails, send emails, etc. You can also attach Azure subscriptions to your Azure Active Directory tenant, and you can attach thousands of other software as a service applications to this Azure Active Directory tenant. So this Azure Active Directory tenant is completely separate from all of these cloud services, including Azure subscriptions. So to wrap this up, Azure Active Directory, that's completely different than on-premises Active Directory. Usually both of these work side by side, and you can connect this Azure Active Directory tenant to your on-premises Active Directory, which can sync the users from your on-premises Active Directory to your Azure Active Directory, and then you can have the users of these connected applications authenticate using Azure Active Directory. And also, obviously, you can make use of several extra services like conditional access, privileged identity management, multi-factor authentication, Azure B2C, etc. I will go through all of these in a separate module, but that's just a very quick overview of what Azure Active Directory is really. Azure Active Directory Objects. Now, you would typically register what we call objects on Azure Active Directory, and those objects consist of users, a group of users, even applications and devices. So again, you wouldn't just typically authenticate users, you would also want to authenticate applications to be able to do certain things, and also devices as well. So maybe you want to restrict a certain device from performing a certain task, and likewise for an application as well. So those are what we call Azure AD Objects. And if I want to give a quick tour of how they look like on the portal, so here I am in the Azure Active Directory blade. And you can see here is where you manage your users. So you can add a new user and you would give him a username and a password. And then you could also create a group of users just to be able to easily assign permissions to a group of users. And you can also register applications. I will talk about application registrations in a separate module. And also we can leverage device registration. So in this case, we can leverage services like Intune to allow your employees to be more productive while at the same time protect the organization. All right, let's talk about Azure Active Directory and how authentication works behind the scenes. So let's say we have a user object that's registered in Azure Active Directory and he's trying to authenticate. So what will happen is if the authentication is actually successful and the user provided the correct credentials as registered in Active Directory, then he would get back an access token and a refresh token. So an access token should always be there by the user for him to access certain resources in the application. So this access token is like an ID that authorizes this user to do certain things. Now, why do we have a refresh token? Because every 60 minutes, the access token is actually going to be expired. And what would happen is after 60 minutes, the user would send the refresh token to Azure Active Directory in order to request a new access token. And that happens every 60 minutes. Obviously, we don't want the user to keep on signing back every 60 minutes. That's why we have a refresh token, which gets sent every 60 minutes or upon expiry of the access token to request a new access token. And then as long as the user has the access token, he's able to do whatever he wants, obviously, based on the permissions that is set for him. All right, so now that we understand how authentication works behind the scenes, let's explore what authentication options we have in Azure Active Directory. Now, the most classic example is just a username and a password, and we all know that's easily crackable, which is why we have methods like multi-factor authentication. And with multi-factor authentication, you not only provide something you know, which is a password, you also provide something you have, which is like a mobile phone, like an SMS, for example, and maybe something you are, like a facial ID or a fingerprint. So even with multi-factor authentication, it's also crackable. So we have several multi-factor authentication options provided to us by Azure Active Directory, and they go from the weakest to the strongest. So starting with SMS. So obviously SMS is way more secure than just having a username and a password. However, obviously if your phone is stolen, then anyone can authenticate. And that's true also for a push notification. So a push notification is also crackable if someone steals your phone. Now, after those two, we have the most secure options, which are the three of those. So starting with the FIDO2, and that's basically a key that you would use to authenticate. And that key actually has a fingerprint that you have to provide in order to authenticate. So it's not just a key, which is something you have, it's also something you are, which is your fingerprint. And that also brings us to Windows Hello, which is also something you are. So if someone wants to authenticate and breach your credentials, he would have to steal you to authenticate, which is obviously not possible. Hopefully not possible. And the last option is the authenticator. So with the authenticator, in order to be able to use the authenticator application in your mobile, you would first have to provide your facial recognition or your fingerprint, etc. So that's also something you are. So generally, the more multi-factor authentication options you have, the better. So the weakest option is just having a password, which is something you know. The next best thing is having something you know and something you have, which is like a phone, but that can also be easily stolen. But the strongest option is having something you know, something you have, and something you are. So unless a person literally steals you, he won't be able to authenticate to Azure Active Directory. All right, let's now explain the concept of application registrations and service principals. Now, I don't know about you, but when I first started, this concept really confused me, and I hope I'll be able to eradicate all of these confusions and try to explain this as simple as possible. Now, it is very easy to visualize how a user can authenticate on Azure and be able to create virtual machines, etc. So what he has to do is, obviously, if the user object is registered in Azure Active Directory, then the user would log in to Azure using his credentials that are managed by Azure Active Directory. And if he has the required permissions, he would be able to create virtual machines. He would be able to update virtual machines. He would be able to create storage accounts, read from storage accounts, etc. So that's very easily understandable with the concept of a user. However, just as we have users that we want to authenticate to Azure Active Directory to be able to perform certain things on Azure, like creating a virtual machine, we also want to limit permissions on applications. And we also want to authorize applications to be able to manage our Azure resources. Now, just as we have users that are registered in Azure Active Directory to be able to perform all that stuff, we also want to register our applications in Azure Active Directory so that we can have our applications authenticate to Azure using Azure Active Directory. And then we can give those applications, just as we give users permissions, we can also give applications permissions to do certain stuff, like create a virtual machine, for example. So let's say you want to, you have a PowerShell script that basically creates a virtual machine. Now, obviously, you can't just have any application creating a virtual machine, just like you can't have any user create a virtual machine in your Azure subscription. He would have to first authenticate, and that's the same for an application. It also has to authenticate to be able to do certain stuff on your Azure subscription, like creating a virtual machine. And just like a user, it has a username and a password, and it needs that username and a password to authenticate to be able to do certain stuff. The application also has a username and a password. In the application, we call them client ID and client secret. So if an application wants to authenticate using Azure Active Directory, it has to provide its client ID and client secret. And only if it provides the client ID and client secret, it would get back, remember, the access token and the refresh token. And with that access token, the application can do certain things on the Azure subscriptions, depending on what permissions has been assigned to it, just like a user. Now, the confusing concept is, what is the difference between application registrations and enterprise applications? So if I go back to my Azure Active Directory portal, the application registrations blade is where you would register your applications. Just as you have the users blade where you create a user, in the application registrations blade, you would create the applications. And in this case, I already did it, but what that does is it will create an instance out of this application registration in the enterprise applications section. So if I copy this client ID, I can actually find it in the enterprise applications section. So when you register an application, it's going to create an instance out of this application registration in the enterprise applications part. And that instance is actually called the service principal. And if you want to go back to our diagram, our application is actually going to use the service principal and not the application registration. So the application registration will create an instance of that application in the enterprise applications section, which is called the service principal, and it would use that service principal to authenticate to Azure Active Directory. Just how a user authenticates using this Azure AD user object, it's the same with the application. So the question is, why do we need to have an instance out of this application registration? So let me give you a very simple example. let's say we want other tenants to leverage this application. Okay, so whether that's in a different company, maybe in the same company, we have several different tenants, and we want those tenants to also leverage this same application to manage their own Azure subscriptions under their tenants. What we would do is we would register this as a multi-tenant application registration. And what this does is basically this configures other tenants to use an instance out of this application registrations in their own tenants. So let me explain this with a diagram. So the other tenant will also create an instance out of the application registration. So they would have an enterprise application or a service principal in their tenant. So the same application registration in this case has two instances, one in my tenant and one in the other tenant. And the application would actually use that service principal, okay, to authenticate to Azure Active Directory and then be able to manage their Azure subscription. So that's why we create an instance out of application registration. So the application registration is actually registered once, and that would create an instance out of it or a service principal out of it, whether in the same tenant or in several other tenants. Privileged identity management is a service that allows you to give access both on Azure AD and on your Azure subscriptions for a set period of time. That's why it's called privileged identity management. So you can elevate the privileges of certain users for a set period of time, whether they are roles on Azure Active Directory or roles on Azure subscriptions. So let's give an example where we want to create a role which is the virtual machine contributor. So the virtual machine contributor on Azure would allow you to create virtual machines, would allow you to delete virtual machines, update virtual machines, etc. And let's say we want users to ask for permissions before getting access to this role. Okay, and not only ask for permissions, but also get those permissions for a set period of time. So the way we would do that is using privileged identity management. So we would go to the privileged identity management blade, and then under here we have Azure AD roles, and we also have Azure resources. So I'm gonna demo that on an Azure Azure resources. So once you click on Azure resources, you would have to first discover your resources to find out what subscriptions you have. In this case, I have this Visual Studio Enterprise subscription, and if I click on it, I could actually create roles which are called eligible assignments. So let's say I want to create the assignment I just mentioned, which is the virtual machine contributor. So I would add that assignment, and then I would select the role which is virtual machine contributor, and then I would choose the member that can ask for this permission. So in this case, it's Abdullah test 1. I would click next, and I can again set certain dates. So in this case, I only want that for today. So I would assign that, and you can have this as eligible or active. So eligible means that the user has to request for access and he has to provide the reason for that. If I choose active, then that role would be active immediately after I click assign. So in this case, let me just demonstrate the eligible part. So if I assign that and I give that a bit, and I go to that user that should request this permission, I would also go back to privileged identity management and then go to resources, and then I would click activate role. So let's say I want to create a virtual machine now. I don't have the permissions, but I just want to activate them for the next 8 hours. So what I would do is I would go to privileged identity management. I would go to activate role, and I can see the eligible assignments to my user. In this case, it's only the virtual machine contributor because that's what I created in the admin account. And then I would choose that and then click on activate. And then you can choose the custom activation start time and end time. In this case, the maximum is 8 hours because this is what has been set by my administrator. And then I would give a reason. For example, I need access, and then that would activate it. And it would then go through a set of validation procedures. And after that, it's going to be successful. And now I will have the virtual machine contributor for only 8 hours. So again, just to summarize all of that, privileged identity management is a service that allows you to elevate your permissions for a set period of time. Again, that's just for more security and to adhere to the concept of just-in-time access. So maybe you just want that user to have this certain permission for a set period of time. And that's where privileged identity management is useful. All right, so what are conditional access policies? Conditional access policies are policies that you apply to users after they authenticate. So an example of such policy can be we only want to restrict this specific user to log in from a certain location. Another example is I only want that user to log in from an iOS device. I don't want him to log in from an Android device, for example. So all of these things are things that can be done using conditional access policies. So I'm gonna demo a very simple example. In this case, I created a named location, which is Jordan, and that's gonna create a list of IP addresses under the Jordan location. I can create a conditional access policy. Let's call it location from Jordan. And then I would choose the specific user to apply that policy from. Okay, so in this case, I want a select user, not all users. Let's say I want Abdullah test 1, for example. I would select that user, and then I would select the condition of being from a specific location. So in this case, I don't want any location. I want a selected location, which in this case is Jordan. Okay, and then I can also create some grant permissions. So in this case, let's say I want the user to go through an MFA process. Okay, I want that user to have a compliant device. I want that user to have a hybrid Azure AD join device, for example. So let's say I want that user to go through an MFA procedure. I would click select and I would create that. So this user now can only log in from Jordan. If it's in any other location, even if he provided the correct credentials, his authentication will be refused. So what is Azure Active Directory B2B, short for business to business? So Azure Active Directory B2B is all about collaboration, okay? Let's say you have an Azure Active Directory tenant and you want to collaborate with other companies, okay? So for example, I want a user from a completely different company in a completely different tenant to collaborate with me and work with me to manage my Azure subscription, for example. So I can create, in this case, a new guest user. He can have at gmail.com, at whatever company.com, and then I can assign permissions to that user to manage my Azure subscriptions. So again, Azure B2B is all about collaboration. It's as simple as that. So you would invite guest users to your own tenant, and then you would collaborate with those guest users to work on your Azure subscriptions, on your Office 365 applications, etc. So what is Azure Active Directory B2C? While Azure Active Directory B2B is all about collaboration, business to business, Azure Active Directory B2C is all about your customers. Okay, so with Azure Active Directory B2C, it's an Active Directory tenant, just like the B2B Active Directory tenant. So you would create that Active Directory B2C tenant, and then you would have to navigate to it by switching the directory, and then you would have access to the B2C tenant, just like the Active Directory B2B tenant. Now, the question is, what's the difference between a B2C tenant and a B2B tenant? Okay, so inside our application itself, we will probably implement an authentication mechanism, okay? The classic way is via a username and a password stored in a database, but that is not a good idea, okay? We can outsource the authentication to an identity provider, and that is what B2C is. We want the usernames and passwords stored inside the infrastructure of these powerful companies with already powerful security measures, okay? There's no need to implement that on our own. So we let customers authenticate in our applications using Azure AD B2C, okay, which can connect to identity providers. And we can have them authenticate using their Google, using their Amazon, their Microsoft, or even their emails.